They said he would never walk again. The doctors in Edinburgh were not being cruel when they said it. They were being honest. The boy lying in that bed, bones twisted, fever that wouldn't break, a body that seemed to have decided, at the age of 9, that it was finished, gave them no medical reason for hope. His mother sat beside him for 3 days without sleeping, holding a hand that barely squeezed back. His father stood in the hallway and wept in the way that men of that era wept, silently, facing the wall, shoulders shaking just enough to notice. His name was Derek William Prince, and what happened next is either the most remarkable story you have never heard, or the most inconvenient one, depending on what you believe. Derek was born on August 14, 1915, in Bangalore, India, to a British military family. His father was an officer in the British Army, the kind of man who wore his uniform like a second skin and believed that discipline was the highest form of love. His mother was refined, educated, exactly the sort of woman who read to her children from Wordsworth and expected them to understand it. They were a family of order, of achievement, of proper things done in proper ways. Derek grew up moving between worlds, India, England, the in-between spaces that colonial children inhabit, belonging fully to none of them. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed the one skill that tends to emerge when a child spends too much time alone with books. He could think, rigorously, precisely, in patterns that most people his age couldn't follow. He won a scholarship to Eton, then another to King's College, Cambridge. At Cambridge, Derek studied Greek and Hebrew philosophy. He was being trained to think about the world as a series of problems to be solved through reason. He was good at it, extraordinarily good. His professors noted his precision, his capacity to hold multiple intellectual frameworks at once, his refusal to accept a conclusion without tracing it back to its foundation. He was the last person anyone expected to be transformed by God. He was, in fact, the last person he expected to be transformed by God. In 1940, Derek was drafted into the British Army. He was 24 years old, a scholar in uniform, carrying Plato's Symposium in his kit bag alongside his rations. He was stationed in Egypt, then Palestine, then the deserts of North Africa, places that were ancient before Europe had cities, places that held the weight of thousands of years of human longing. He had been thinking about God before the army, not believing, thinking. There is a difference, and Derek understood that difference better than most. He had read the arguments. He had measured them. He had found them interesting the way a man finds a locked door interesting. There might be something behind it, or there might not. But somewhere in the desert, he never pinned it to a precise date, though people always asked. Something happened that his philosophy couldn't account for. He had been given a Bible, not by a chaplain, not by a well-meaning evangelist. He found it, or it found him. He would later refuse to explain which. He began reading it the way he read everything, analytically, looking for internal inconsistencies, ready to catalog its failures. He found something else. Later in his life, Derek would describe that period as a sustained encounter with a person, not a text, not a system of thought. A person who seemed to be present in the pages in a way that defied his categories. He was not a man given to mysticism. He resisted the description even as he lived it. But what he said, repeatedly for the rest of his life, was this: I was not looking for God, I was evaluating him. And at some point I realized I was no longer the one doing the evaluating. He gave his life to Christ in a British Army barracks alone, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a war. No choir, no altar call, no one to witness it. Just a man and a Bible and a transaction that changed everything. Now here is where the story gets complicated, because what happened next was not a smooth ascent into spiritual greatness. What happened next was sickness. Derek was struck with a chronic skin condition that the army doctors could not diagnose and could not treat. It spread across his hands, then his arms. It wept and cracked and refused to heal. He was transferred from unit to unit, from doctor to doctor, and the answer was always the same. We don't know what this is. We don't know how to fix it. He was in and out of military hospitals for years, and in those hospitals, lying in cots in Egypt, in Palestine, in places where the ceiling was canvas and the heat was oppressive, and there was nothing to do but think and pray. Derek began to read the scriptures with the same rigor he had once brought to Plato. He began to build a theology, piece by piece, not borrowed from a denomination or a tradition, but assembled from the text itself. with the same Greek and Hebrew tools he had sharpened at Cambridge. He began to understand something about healing. He prayed for his own hands, for weeks, for months, and one morning, he woke up and they were clear. The doctors examined him. They had no explanation, the condition was simply gone. Derek didn't make much of it publicly at the time. He was a careful man. A scholar's instinct is to verify, to be certain, to resist the dramatic claim. But he knew what had happened, and he knew that it mattered. By the end of the war, Derek was a different man from the one who had entered it. He had come in carrying Plato. He came out carrying something older. He was discharged in Palestine, present-day Israel, in 1945. And in one of those pivotal moments that seem random from the outside but feel, to the person inside them, like the hinge of everything, he met a woman named Lydia Christensen. Lydia was a Danish woman living in Jerusalem. She had run a children's home there for years, caring for 8 girls, Jewish, Arab, British, who had no one else. She was decades older than Derek. She was not beautiful in the conventional way. She was not the kind of woman a Cambridge scholar was expected to fall in love with. Derek married her. His family did not understand. His former colleagues did not understand. There was no social logic to it, no strategic advantage, nothing that made sense from the outside. But Derek was not operating from the outside anymore. He had become a man who moved by a different kind of knowing. They took in the 8 girls together. Then more, Derek became a father to children who shared none of his blood and all of his attention. He learned what it meant to love, not because someone earned it, but because they needed it. This, too, was preparation. He didn't know for what yet. The years that followed were years of formation. Derek and Lydia moved to England, then to Canada, then to Kenya, then back again. He was pastoring, teaching, building a way of thinking about Scripture that was rigorous enough to satisfy his academic training, and alive enough to account for what he had actually experienced. He preached in churches and in open fields. He taught in Bible colleges and on street corners. He developed a voice, not a theatrical voice, not the tent revivalist roar that some of his contemporaries were famous for, but a quiet, precise, relentless voice. The voice of a man who had thought about every word before he said it. People came, not thousands yet, not the crowds that would come later, but people found their way to him the way people find their way to a fire in a cold room, because there was something there that was real. He began to understand what his calling actually was. Derek Prince was not going to be a miracle worker in the traditional sense. He was not going to be a man known for one spectacular night under a tent. He was going to be something rarer and in some ways more dangerous. A teacher. A man who would take the foundations of what Christians believed and examine them the way a builder examines the soil before laying stones. If the foundation was wrong, everything built on it was at risk. And he was beginning to see that a great deal of what was being built, in churches across America and Britain and Africa, was built on foundations that had never been properly laid. His first breakthrough came not from a sermon but from a crisis. It was 1963. Derek and Lydia were in the United States. Their youngest daughter, one of the 8 girls they had taken in, now grown, struggling, was in the grip of something that no one in her life had language for. Her behavior had shifted over years. There were moments of genuine warmth followed by periods of dark, inexplicable withdrawal. She heard things. She was convinced of things that were not true. The medical establishment called it one thing. The church establishment didn't have a category for it at all. Derek sat with her for hours. He prayed. He fasted. He brought every theological tool he had, and in that room, in a moment that he described afterward with great reluctance, because he knew exactly how it would sound, something left her. He called it what he called it, a demon. He was aware that the word made people uncomfortable. He was a Cambridge man. He knew what the word did to a room full of educated people. He used it anyway, because he had tried every other word, and none of them were accurate. He had tried psychological disturbance and spiritual oppression and emotional trauma. He had watched those words fail to describe what he had witnessed. What he had witnessed was a presence that was not her, and the departure of that presence, and his daughter, sitting up straighter, breathing differently, looking at him with eyes that were clear. He spent the next decade trying to understand what had happened and why it worked. The result was some of the most careful, least hysterical writing on spiritual warfare in the 20th century. Derek refused to sensationalize. He refused to turn deliverance into a spectacle or a stage show. He wrote and taught with the same methodical precision he had once applied to Greek philosophy, and he reached conclusions that were as uncomfortable for the charismatic fringe as they were for the rationalist mainstream. He made enemies on both sides, which in retrospect is often the sign that someone is telling the truth. Now we have to talk about Lydia, because this story cannot be told honestly without telling you what her death cost him. Lydia died in 1975. She had been ill for some time, and when she went, she took a dimension of Derek's life that he could not reconstruct. He had built everything in partnership with her: the children's home, the early ministry, the understanding of what it meant to love someone you had chosen, rather than someone circumstance had assigned to you. He grieved. He grieved in the way that a precise man grieves, quietly, working through it systematically, refusing to be publicly undone. And underneath that precision was a devastation that people close to him recognized even when he didn't name it. 2 years later, he married again. Ruth Baker was an American woman, a widow herself, a woman of deep faith and practical grace. They had known each other through mutual friends in ministry. The marriage surprised people. It surprised Derek a little, but it was real, and together they entered the most productive period of his teaching life. The 1970s and 1980s were decades when Derek Prince Ministries, the organization he had built around his teaching, was reaching hundreds of thousands of people. Not through television spectacles, not through stadium events, through cassette tapes. This detail is worth pausing on, because it says something important about who Derek was. Other ministers of his era were building platforms, television programs, prayer towers, enormous, visible monuments to anointing and authority. Derek was sitting in a recording studio, speaking into a microphone, talking through the biblical foundations of Christian life, in a voice that sounded like a retired professor, which is essentially what he was. And those tapes were being duplicated and mailed to people in nursing homes, in prisons, in remote African villages, in Chinese house churches, in former Soviet bloc countries where his name could not be spoken publicly. He was reaching the people who couldn't get to the show. He was reaching the people who needed foundations, not spectacle. In 1984, Ruth died. She had been sick with leukemia. She had fought it with the same faith that had characterized everything else in her life. And then she was gone. Derek was 68 years old. He had buried 2 wives. He had buried, in various ways, versions of himself. The Cambridge philosopher, the army conscript, the young husband who thought he understood love, the middle-aged teacher who thought he understood loss. What remained was something stripped down and essential. People who knew him in those years describe a man who was whiter than before. Not sad exactly, not diminished, more like a tree in winter, less leaf, more structure. The architecture of everything he was had become visible in a way it hadn't been when there was more on the surface. He continued to teach. He continued to write. He continued to travel, improbably, exhaustingly, into his 70s and 80s, teaching in places that tested a younger man's endurance. Israel remained central to his ministry. He had lived there. He had watched it become a modern nation. He had watched prophecy connect to history in ways that made his scholar's mind go very still. He taught on Israel until the end, quietly, carefully, with the same refusal to simplify or dramatize that had marked his entire life. Here is the question that people always raise when they tell the story of Derek Prince. They say, yes, but what about his theology? What about the controversies? What about the period in the 1980s when his name became attached to a movement? Shepherding, they called it, or discipleship, depending on who was talking. That ended up causing real harm to real people. It is a fair question, and it deserves an honest answer. Derek was one of several teachers who, in the 1970s, became convinced that the church was missing something. Proper authority structures, genuine accountability, relationships of spiritual covering that would protect believers from error. The logic was coherent. The desire behind it was sincere. The execution, in many places, became something else entirely. The movement produced stories of control, of people told they could not make decisions, whom to marry, where to live, what jobs to take, without permission from their spiritual authority. of relationships that curdled from care into coercion, of genuine faith being weaponized by systems that were never meant to go that far. Derek eventually stepped away from the movement publicly. He acknowledged that it had caused harm. He did so without the kind of defensive maneuvering that characterizes men who cannot admit error. He named it clearly. But the damage had been done, people had been hurt, and some of those people carry those wounds to this day. This is part of his story. Not a footnote, not a caveat. Part of it, because the question of how a man who had spent his life thinking more carefully than almost anyone about the foundations of Christian life could be implicated in a movement that undermined those very foundations. That question doesn't have an easy answer. What it has is a real one. Power without accountability destroys even the people who carry it honestly, and even the most careful man in the room can miss something when he is surrounded by people who trust him too completely. Derek William Prince died on September 24, 2003. He was 88 years old. He died in Jerusalem, the city where his life had cracked open, where he had met Lydia, where he had watched the ancient become contemporary. He was buried there. He had published over 50 books. He had recorded hundreds of hours of teaching. He had spoken, by various estimates, to audiences in more than 100 countries. His cassette tapes had been listened to in languages he didn't speak, in places he had never been, by people who would never know his face. At his memorial, people stood and spoke about what they had received from him. They described moments in prison cells and hospital rooms and isolated farmhouses and refugee camps where they had pressed play on a tape player and heard a quiet voice, precise, unhurried, relentless, explain what the scripture actually said. Not what the tradition said, not what the denomination required, what it said, and it had held them together when nothing else could. So what do we do with Derek Prince? Do we hold up only the mountain and ignore the stone that slipped? Do we dismiss the 50 years of teaching because of the season when the teaching was misused? Do we demand that he be perfect before we allow that he was useful? Or do we sit with the uncomfortable, irreducible truth that real human beings, even the ones God uses most, are never just one thing? Derek was a scholar. He was a mystic. He was a father to children who were not his own. He was a husband twice over, broken by grief twice over, and rebuilt. He was a man who spent 40 years building careful foundations and 1 decade building on an unstable one, and who lived long enough to acknowledge the difference. He was not the story that either his admirers or his critics want to tell. He was the actual story. And the actual story is always stranger, more painful, more hopeful, and more instructive than the one we construct to make ourselves comfortable. There is one more thing. In the last years of his life, Derek was asked repeatedly about the shepherding controversy, about the harm it had caused, about how he reconciled it with the rest of his ministry. And he gave a consistent answer that his questioners sometimes found unsatisfying and that he insisted was the only honest one available. He said, "I cannot reconstruct what I understood then, as though I understand it now. I can only tell you that I tried to walk by what I knew, that I failed in ways that cost others, and that I have asked God for mercy on that. I cannot offer you a neater version. This is the version that actually happened." There is a kind of courage in that. Not the dramatic courage of a man who charges a machine gun nest. The quieter courage of a man who refuses to revise his own story into something that would be easier to admire. He gave his life to building foundations. And in the end, the most foundational thing he demonstrated was this: that the truth about a human life, unedited, unpolished, held in full, is always more useful than the legend. Even when the truth is harder to carry, especially when the truth is harder to carry.